he was flown to Australia and positively identified his attacker, Ivan Milat.
With that identification, we found a lot of other corroborative evidence that we could use. For example, we had found that Ivan was available, if you like, was not at work on any of the dates when the murders or abductions took place. We had conducted very extensive inquiries into the weapons that were being purchased and the bullets that had been used.
The police now had sufficient evidence to arrest Ivan Milat for the attempted murder of Paul Onions, and were able to get the search warrant they so desperately needed. They planned to search not only Ivan Milat's house, but also the houses of his family. This was the only way to find out if he worked alone or if someone else had joined him on his sadistic rampage. Ivan Milat gained immense pleasure from the stalking, entrapment, and killing of his victims. His prey, young backpackers alone on a deserted highway. After months of close surveillance, the police finally got a search warrant and raided Milat's home on May 22, 1994. Journalist Neil Mercer closely followed the case.
When the police raided Ivan's house, they found a treasure trove of evidence. There were backpacks, there were tents, there were cooking sets that had belonged to some of the backpackers, there were cameras, there were all sorts of things that they could trace back to individual backpackers.
Police also raided the houses of other members of the Milat family. There they found a huge amount of ammunition, an arsenal of weapons, and rope and cable ties that were identical to those found at the murder scenes.
Items were found in almost every house that related to the murder, one way or another. And also, in every occasion, the people who had possession of that property pointed the finger at Ivan as being the source of it.
Milat, like so many other sexually sadistic serial killers, was a compulsive trophy taker, retaining clothing and other personal items so that he could use them later to relive his actions. These trophies would form a major part of the evidence that would later convict Milat.
These killers become very adept at concealing their weapons, but by the same token, they want to keep them. So they're attached to them, and even though they're the thing that might lead to their conviction, they're not going to give them up.
Milat was finally in police custody, yet he maintained his innocence.
He, I believe, thought that he was still in charge and in control, and I don't think that at that stage he believed he was going to get charged. He's never admitted to anything.
Well, it's often said that the reason that offenders like this don't confess is because they want to keep their fantasies and the events to themselves so that they can enjoy their imagination.
Ivan Milat did not conform to the usual serial killer profiles. Most serial killers do not murder both sexes, and very rarely did they kill more than one victim at a time. Milat has never spoken publicly about his crimes, so experts can only theorize about what turned him into such a brutal and remorseless killer. According to forensic psychiatrist Rod Milton, Milat must have been motivated by power.
Well, he did it, number one, because it was enjoyable for him to do that, and he perceived it as satisfying some emotional need that wasn't being satisfied in any other way. And he also did it because he lacked the internal prohibitions that would have prevented other people from causing such suffering.
A life of petty crime had transcended into rape and eventually murder, suggesting that maybe he was intrinsically evil. But it could be equally argued that events in his life had provided the catalyst for his murderous actions.
There was no suggestion that there was a particular part of his brain, if you like, driving him to commit these crimes. This was about Ivan being in control. I think his satisfaction was about, I've gained their confidence, now I've gained control of them, and I'm now going to exert that control. And that was a progressive thing through from the abduction through to the actual murders. The amount of wounds from knives and bullets that were inflicted on the victims shows that it was not just a matter of killing them, that there was a satisfaction to be derived from the continual inflicting of harm and injury on the victims.
I would say he was more than twisted. He was definitely gone. Everybody in the family, a few of my brothers said, well, maybe there's something wrong with me. There was definitely something wrong with him.
And one of the interesting things about Ivan Milat is if you look at the period of the serial killings, it's a period, it starts just after he breaks up with his wife, and then another relationship with a second woman also fails. He then kills the first two young backpackers, and the killing only stops some years later when he enters into a relationship.
Australia's biggest murder trial began in March 1996. Ivan Milat pleaded not guilty to all charges. The parents of all the victims were in attendance.
I was looking at this man every day, and I couldn't bring myself to believe that such an insignificant little man could have wrought such horror and misery on so many people.
Milat's defense lawyer was Terry Martin. He was faced with a difficult task. His client was denying any involvement in the crimes he had been charged with.
His instructions were that he did not do it. And as I say, it goes from there, though. If he didn't do it, then someone terribly close to him must have. We were permitted to conduct ourselves in the way that we did do, which was the proper way to do it, and see whether or not anyone in the family or associated with the family may have been in the frame rather than Ivan Milat, and thereby create the doubt that it was Ivan Milat.
But we found no evidence of a second person. He was the one who gave the property to friends and relatives to wear. He was the one who had control of the type of bullets that we knew were used, and his house itself, is fair to say, it was like an Aladdin's gold mine when you searched it for the amount of property that was around him. And I think that reflects very much on his attitude of, I'm in control, I'm in charge, and he gets his satisfaction in a variety of ways. But also, I think he was such a control freak that there's no way he would have wanted to share what he saw as his glory and satisfaction with another person.
There were various pieces of vital evidence directly related to Caroline Clarke, Milat's last victim. The prosecutor in the case was Mark Tedeschi.
There was some rope that was found at Ivan's home, in a bag, in a pillowcase actually. There was some blood on this rope. And this blood was analysed, and this English forensic scientist was able to say that the blood from the rope was the kind of blood that you would expect from a child of these two parents.
Police also found parts of one of the murder weapons hidden in the wall cavity in Ivan Milat's home.
They could conclusively show by ballistics evidence that it was one of the two weapons that had been used at two of the death scenes. Ivan's response to that was, I know nothing about this weapon. Even though it was painted with camouflage paint, and there were a whole lot of other weapons of guns that he acknowledged were his, painted with exactly the same kind of camouflage paint.
One item Milat didn't hide was a framed photograph of his girlfriend wearing a distinctive shirt. A shirt that had been owned by Caroline Clarke. Her mother, Jackie, remembers it well.
She bought it when we were still living down south, and it was one of her favourite garments. She was always wearing it, and obviously went with her to Australia.
His removing parts of clothing and I think a rucksack and perhaps other possessions is characteristic of this kind of offender, and to give it to a girlfriend is also characteristic. The hunter who goes out and kills some creature in the bush and then has the head stuffed and puts it over the mantelpiece, and every time he sees it he thinks, what a great man I am to have killed this wild beast.
Despite the amount of damning evidence, Ivan Milat remained confident. His bravado would follow him all the way to trial. Ivan Milat was so confident that he would be cleared of all charges that he actually chose to take the stand at his trial.
I can't say that that was the wrong choice, because if he did not, there's overwhelming evidence there against him calling for an explanation. The jury would want to hear an explanation saying, why have you got all of that property at your house? Tell us about it. I think he presented himself in a poorer light, unfortunately. Well, it certainly didn't help him.
There was one moment where he was being asked about rubber gloves that had been found at his house. And it was towards the end of the day. It had been a very long cross-examination. And just before 4 o'clock, just before the court's about to rise, Tedeschi asked him a question about the gloves and the forest, and Milat blurted out, "I never wore no..." And he stopped.
And you could have heard a pin drop in the courtroom. It was a magical moment. And Tedeschi sort of went on and said, "Do you mean you didn't wear them in the forest?" And then turned to the judge and said, and to the jury, and said, "I think that would be a good moment to adjourn for the day." And so this was left hanging with the jurors overnight. That was the moment that if anybody had doubted the man's guilt, there was something about that moment that said, yes, you did it.
That, coupled with the physical evidence they had, the ballistics, the blood, the DNA, it made for a pretty compelling case.
Ivan Milat was found guilty and was sentenced to spend the rest of his natural life in prison for the 7 counts of murder and to an additional 6 years for the attempted abduction of Paul Onions. To this date, Milat still hasn't admitted his guilt.
The jail he's in Goulburn, it's a special jail, and it's a prison built inside a prison. What's he going to do in there? I don't know. I don't really care. It's his fault for landing in there.
According to his younger brother, George, Ivan only confessed to his mother.
Mum didn't want to believe this one, but she had doubts, and so did all of us. He's been in trouble all his life.
Before her death in 2001, she went to visit Ivan in prison to seek the truth.
And then next time she went there, I asked, did he tell you, looking across the table, did he tell you anything that you did not want to hear? We looked at each other, and he said, he admitted it. He's not going to admit it publicly. Now she's gone, but she knew the truth before she went.
There's occasional outbreaks of Ivan Milat is innocent, but I just think that's rubbish. I think if you look at all the evidence, if you read the transcript, if you look at the exhibits, where they were found, and Milat's answers in court, there is no doubt that he's the man who killed those 7 people.
Police have good reason to believe that Ivan Milat is responsible for more than just these murders.
But I believe it's in the stage of